What is the worst argument for atheism? The debate about the existence of God has been raging for thousands of years, and both sides have put forward dozens if not hundreds of arguments for their position. But of all these arguments, one from the atheist side stands out as particularly weak, and that argument is the one that says, in the words of Christopher Hitchens,
"Who designed the designer? Don't you run the risk with the presumption of a God and a designer and an originator of asking, well, where does that come from? Where does that come from? And locking yourself into an infinite regress."
Who designed the designer? Or to put it in different words that are sometimes used, if God caused everything, what caused God? This is a tremendously bad argument. Don't get me wrong here. There are some very strong arguments for atheism out there, including some that can shake the faith of even the most well-versed Christian. This just isn't one of them. At all. I suppose the idea that's being suggested here is that the so-called first cause arguments for God are basically reducible to the formula that if everything that exists must have a cause, and the universe exists, therefore the universe must have a cause, and that cause is God. And yeah, I agree that if a Christian offered that as a proof for God, it would be a bad argument. But the fact is that no serious theist of any stripe has ever offered an argument like that. In the words of the Catholic philosopher Edward Feser, you will not find such an argument in Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, Anselm, Bonaventure, Aquinas, Scotus, Suarez, Leibniz, Clarke, Locke, Berkeley, Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, Mortimer Adler, Richard Taylor, Richard Swinburne, Robert Koons, Alexander Pruss, Christopher Martins, David Odenberg, William Lane Craig, or, as far as I know, in the works of any other philosopher who has ever defended the cosmological argument. Obviously, it's absurd to start an argument for God with the idea that everything that exists must have a cause, because that would mean that God has a cause, which would defeat the whole point of trying to find an ultimate cause of things. No serious Christian would ever suggest otherwise. Well, almost no serious Christian. There is one famous Christian philosopher who did think otherwise, and said that God, too, must have a cause. And that is René Descartes. If Christians have anyone to blame for the popularity of the what caused God argument, it's Descartes. Descartes really did believe that everything that exists needed a cause for its existence, and he really did try to use that notion to prove that God exists. And when asked what the cause of God could be, if everything that exists needs a cause, Descartes responded with two simple, horrifying Latin words that doomed Christian thought to centuries of confusion. Causa sui. God is cause of himself. From a certain perspective, this answer makes sense. What else could be the cause of God, if not God himself? Only an infinite being could possibly create an infinite being, and since there could only ever possibly be one infinite being, this one being that creates the one being would have to be God, so God would have to create himself. The problem is, nothing can create itself. You can't cause yourself. In order to cause yourself, you would have to have something, whatever that something is, and then give it to yourself. But if you already have it, how can you give it to yourself? If I wanted to give myself $20, I couldn't do that because I would have to already have the $20 I wanted to give me in order to give me the $20. So I wouldn't really gain anything from giving me the $20. So I wouldn't really be giving it to myself. In the same way, in order for God to give himself existence, he would already have to have existence, in which case he wouldn't be giving himself existence and wouldn't really be causing himself at all. Causing yourself is just an absurd notion. So Descartes' notion of God is just an absurd idea. And philosophers after Descartes recognized this. The problem is, with how influential Descartes became for modern philosophy, modern thinkers started to assume that the idea of God as causa sui was a standard one in Christian philosophy. They started to imagine that all Christians envisioned God as cause of himself, and really that all the older, more traditional arguments for God were just different versions of Descartes' argument saying that everything needs to have a cause. And since they knew that the response to Descartes' argument was to say, if everything had a cause, what caused God? They started to use that line of reasoning as a response to every single argument for God, even ones that had nothing to do with Descartes. And so the worst argument for atheism got started. Alright then, if Descartes really was the first Christian to define God as cause of himself, what did other philosophers say about God before that? To understand this, we need to go back to one of the very first philosophers, a guy by the name of Aristotle. You may have heard of him. Aristotle believed that there had to exist a being that he called the unmoved mover. The reason for this has to do with the nature of change. When something changes, Aristotle says, it goes from a state of potential, or being able to be a certain way, to actually being that way. He called that actuality. But only something that's already actual can make a potential thing actual, for the same reason we talked about when we said that nothing can be the cause of itself. So whenever we see a thing change, there must be something else already existing and already actual to make that thing change. Change requires a changer. It requires something actual giving actuality to a potential thing. And more than that, Aristotle argued that anything that can change cannot be the ultimate explanation for change. Because if something can change, there has to be something that could change it, that could actualize its potential. And then that first thing that we were talking about would not be the ultimate explanation of change, because there's something that changed it. So in order to have a complete explanation of change, there must be something which just is actual, without any potential, and which changes other things without itself being changed. Something that, because it's not made out of any potential, could not even in theory be changed. A purely actual actualizer, or to use a different name that's sometimes used, an unmoved mover. And because when you start analyzing what this unmoved mover would have to look like, and how it would have to be immaterial and all good and timeless and all powerful and all knowing to really be an unmoved mover, Christians have traditionally recognized this unmoved mover of Aristotle with God. And that gives us a good way to look at how traditional theism has traditionally seen God's relation to causality. As the unmoved mover, God is able to cause other things without himself being caused. In fact, it's because God is not caused by anything that he's able to serve as the ultimate explanation of change. If God was caused by something else, he would have to be subject to change, and therefore he wouldn't be an unmoved mover. So in order for God to really be God, he has to be uncaused. This isn't just like a cheap way to sidestep the question of what caused God. It's the natural explanation of the consequences of God's role of an unmoved mover. Aristotle's argument for God doesn't work unless God is uncaused. If we're talking about something that's caused, we're not talking about God. It's the same with other arguments for God. They establish not just the existence of God, but the existence of an uncaused God, and say that if God was caused, he wouldn't explain what they're trying to explain. That goes for arguments like the argument from contingency, the Kalam cosmological argument, the moral argument, and all these other famous arguments for God. Despite what someone like Hitchens might say, these arguments don't start by making the claim that everything must have a cause, and then carving out a little arbitrary exception in the case of God and saying, but he's the only thing that doesn't have a cause. Instead, they start by making neutral philosophical observations like change exists and is the actualization of a potential, and then showing how that premise naturally leads to the existence of an unchanging, uncaused being. When atheists ask what caused God, they miss the whole point of the philosophical arguments for God and show that they really have a shallow understanding of the debate about God. So if you're an atheist watching this, I would recommend that you encourage any friends you have that take this approach to find a different argument. They're just not doing their side any favors here. But wherever you're coming from, whether you're an atheist or a theist or undecided, I hope you'll consider checking out the rest of my channel to find out more about the philosophical arguments for God, the really good ones, and also my responses to some of the better, stronger arguments for atheism. And also, please consider subscribing to help my channel grow and reach more people. Thank you for watching this video, and God bless.